Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. In this episode, you will hear part one of my conversation with Celeste Kong, professor and the chair of general dentistry at the Boston University Henry M. Goldman School of Dental Medicine. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I am your host, Jeff Yan. My guest today is Celeste Kong, professor and the chair of general dentistry at the Boston University Henry M. Goldman School of Dental Medicine. Welcome, Celeste.
Hello, Jeff.
Well, it is a great honor to have you here on Digication Scholars Conversations. And also because this is, as you had mentioned to me before, this is your 40th year at Boston University.
Boston University, yes. 40 years at Boston University.
That's amazing.
And it's been an amazing time, and I've had a wonderful career here. It's great.
And as a professor and chair of general dentistry, do you want to tell us just a little bit about, sort of your journey at BU? And I mean, it's pretty amazing.
Well, I came here to do my prosthodontic program in the early 80s. And I was a foreign dental graduate, originally from the Philippines. I'd left the Philippines when I was very young, but and then I had relatives here in Boston. We used to visit all the time, and I would say to my parents, I really want to go to school in Boston. And when it came to graduate school, they let me come. And I've never left. So Boston University hired me out of my program, and I was teaching part-time. I eventually practiced also part-time with my husband, who's also a prosthodontist. He retired a few years ago, and now it's my turn to retire. So it's been good. I've been chair of the department now for about 7 years. And prior to that, I was the director of restorative dentistry for about 15 years. So I've had a lot of time affecting some change and, in terms of curriculum and assessments for my students. And it's been really wonderful.
You are so modest. And I know that you are not only highly respected by your colleagues, but also by your students as well. And congratulations on the retirement.
Yes,
I hope you get to go and enjoy and do things, now that your husband's also retired too.
Yes,
and,
absolutely. Yeah, I am. We're looking forward to it. COVID definitely put a damper on some of the trips that we had planned earlier, but I think we're coming back to whatever our new normal is.
That's right.
And, I think we'll all get used to this. We all the dental schools had to shift gears when many schools had to close for at least a brief period of time, and then, had to figure out how to manage a school with not the maximum number of students in attendance. Mm-hmm. I said, if this had happened maybe even 10 years ago, we wouldn't have Zoom. We wouldn't have been able to do classes remotely as easily as we eventually did. So definitely, we now have the tools, and they've even been enhanced, right?
Yeah.
To make learning from anywhere possible.
You're right. There, it would have been, if the same, disease had just come in, probably even just a few years ago. I mean, we had Skype, I guess, but it was not good enough.
Yeah, Skype would not have been good enough. Yeah. I even had trouble using it just for 4 people to get on at
Yeah,
the
with like
same
a
time.
family, sometimes, and even that
Right.
is, yeah. So I
Yeah.
think it was almost just, it was just in time. And
Yeah.
imagine if we didn't have that, the
Yeah.
experience
It
would have
would have
been,
been horrible.
yeah.
I will say, CODA, you probably heard this
Yes.
story, but CODA tried to tell the dental schools that they had to keep the seniors for an extra 6 months. And we go, there's no way to keep a class an extra 6 months when the other people are in the schedule,
Yeah, right. There isn't a physical way to do it. There isn't
Right.
probably a financial way to do it. There isn't yeah, that it's a no
Correct.
go. Yeah.
So, whatever we could do to modify, and all the things we needed to do for simulation as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much, that you have to do that are obviously very hands on. There's no substitute for it.
Correct. There's no
Uh,
substitute,
it's tough.
for in-person patient care. And certainly we could do some things simulation, but in the end, the students were able to come back. We opened fully within probably, I want to say within 5 months. Um, I think we were lucky. A lot of schools didn't do
Well,
that.
BU did like a really really good job managing through this COVID situation, and
Yeah.
I spoke with a lot of schools throughout, and obviously having a robust medical school and a school of public health on campus provides you with
Yeah.
a some
Resources.
resources that other schools may not have,
Yeah.
and I feel like that BU was easily one of the very first schools who were able to and willing to and efficiently able to basically do massive testing on a regular basis.
Yes. I'm sure you heard that.
Yeah,
Um, every week for everybody. I mean, that's a
yeah,
tremendous undertaking. We're a
right,
huge
right.
institution.
And that was before when that was the norm. Well, it sort of became the norm, but not
Yeah,
even really for everyone. But
correct.
you were, I feel like that you were doing that starting in like September of 2020. Um,
Yeah, we were doing it pretty early.
you
It
were
was actually surprising
It
how
was really
quickly,
early. Yeah, really,
yeah,
really
how
early.
quickly,
Yeah,
because again, we had the equipment, they shifted gears to change the equipment for its use,
yeah.
and
And I
it's
remember
amazing.
school announced you spent a lot of money
Yeah,
on it, but it was I guess a necessary step,
yeah. But
and I'm
for us, it was
yeah,
necessary to keep everyone safe and to keep, not just the students and the patients, but everybody. So I think Boston University did a really excellent job,
yeah.
keeping people safe. It's actually funny. Today is the last day that anyone who is asymptomatic can be tested. Um,
Yeah.
if you are symptomatic, you can continue to be tested
Mhm,
at one location.
mhm.
But we had 5 locations where people could be no, 4 locations where people could be tested,
Yeah.
um, on University Medical and Charles River campus.
Yeah, it's tremendous what you were able to pull off. I remember talking to, various other folks, and they were telling me what you were, all trying to do, and I'm going, well, I guess that if anyone can pull it off, you guys would be able to.
Yeah.
Congratulations on doing that, managing that throughout. Um, I I wanted to sort of go back to what you were saying in sort of the 80s. You were a
Hmm.
student from the Philippines,
Yes.
um, in a medical school. What was that like? I mean,
Yes.
were there many other international students? Were there many other women in the program?
So that's what surprised me the most about arriving here. I went to the University of the Philippines, and my mother was also a dentist from that university. And her classmates were predominantly female, as was mine. I think we had 8 males in my class, and that was the largest group of males for a while. So coming to the United States, where in the PROS program, there were 10 of us, and I was the only female, I'm like, this is different.
Yeah.
I didn't expect it. But I remember in those days, I remember people weren't perhaps quite as PC.
Mm.
And my clinic director, usually gave me the more, shall I say, difficult patients to manage.
Oh, really?
Because
Oh, wow.
he felt I had more patience. And he introduced me to this guy who had a pretty good title here at the university. And he became a dear friend of mine afterwards. But I remember the first day I met him, my clinic director says, Dr. Celeste Kong is going to take care of your needs, and you'll be fine. And he looked at me and he says, "You're assigning me to a woman?" And I think my facial expression was just that. Yeah. Oh, he doesn't want to be assigned to a woman. And then he laughed and he said, "I'm just kidding. It's fine." But yeah, there weren't that many women at the dental school in the 80s. But now we're more than 50%. We're the majority of the DMD class. So it's a huge change.
Yeah, lots have changed. And I'm sure that you have seen a lot of that now. You had mentioned to me before that, it's 40 years, and you had said that there are multiple generations of students.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So what does that mean? That means your initial students had graduated, had children, and they had come and graduated.
Correct. It's in fact, I hired one of my relatively junior faculty members. He's been with me now, I want to say 3 years, maybe 4. His parents were my students as well. Both of his parents.
Wow.
So, it's like all in the family. And that's not an unusual story. One of my older colleagues said pretty soon he'll be seeing the grandchildren.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you this then. It must be, first of all, it must be heartwarming to have that experience.
Sure. Absolutely.
And of course for parents to then have, send or had influenced their children to, come back to this speaks to, the school itself, right?
Absolutely.
Otherwise they wouldn't recommend it.
Right.
But it must be also amazing to see, like you said, the number of women versus, then and now.
The changes.
All kinds of changes that must have happened.
Tons of different changes.
Yeah.
I was just talking to another colleague who is also retiring, and I said, remember pre-PowerPoint when we were using slides and we'd have to make our own slides and process our own slides, and the person I was speaking to is also a master's of fine arts. So she used to make 3D cardboard visual aids in order to show jaw movement,
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, nowadays we have all of these videos for students to see jaw movement, but not in those days, So it's really a different environment for the students to learn, and it's a different environment for faculty members to process educational materials.
Yeah.
I was saying goodbye to some of our IT guys today, one of whom started here with us more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
And I said, you trained me to use Microsoft Office. He says, I think we learned PowerPoint together. So,
yeah.
So it's huge changes, right?
That's pretty awesome.
Technology and the people who are coming in and taking dentistry. I mean, definitely. I think I want to say we're almost 60% women compared to the guys this year. Um, and that seems to be a trend even in college, right? So there are less men entering college than there is women. And so I think it's just a reflection of what the population is showing in terms of going to graduate school and to college.
Mm-hmm. Well, so let me ask you something that I sometimes find that people romanticize about the good old days, right? And I do
Yeah.
sometimes myself too. Um, I was trained as an architect, and my version of the good old days is that people sketch with their pencils and charcoal, and
Yes.
get their hands really dirty and building things, and of course now it's people build 3D simulations of everything,
Right.
which is at a much higher fidelity and resolution than we'd ever be
Oh,
able to draw with a
oh
pencil.
yeah.
But
Having,
there is
yes.
some parts of that pencil that was tactile, that makes you think a certain different way. Are there things like that in dentistry or in your field that you feel like, wow, what the way that we used to do certain things is, that you
Well,
miss?
I think that you're going to meet old timers such as myself who are going to say, um, we had to learn everything the hard way in terms of making our own 3D models,
Mm,
like you say, tactile.
mm,
So you had to use different parts of your brain to do that.
mm-hmm,
Because you had to feel things, you had to visualize things in 3D and then reproduce them with your hands. That's a very different learning skill than having a 3D representation on the screen that you're manipulating. It's not the same skill. And in the end, you're still supposed to do something in your patient's mouth that produces that tooth or produces that provisional restoration.
mm-hmm.
But if all
I absolutely get that. And actually, this is so interesting. Um, See, when I was thinking about, like my version of using a pencil or a piece of charcoal or chalk or whatever, um, sure, the materials, there's a certain sort of grittiness and, style to it, but it's not that. It's that you have to understand certain things in a way that gives you a different perspective than if you were just to go to the material library and pick brick and then beautiful bricks appeared.
Mhm.
But when you have to actually like put things together and see that there's mortars between the brick, and like how does the brick turn a corner, and how do you make an arch, and you kind of suddenly you start to use different parts of your brain to do those things. And I do think that there's a certain amount of sort of understanding,
Mhm.
um, that I think you are really correct. Like, this is why I like talking to you, because you're an educator and you're immediately thinking about the metacognition sort of implication, which is, no, you think about these things differently. So
Yes.
because you've touched the jaw and it only moves this way, you couldn't move it in this other angle. And therefore, if we have to reach over there, there's only one way to do it, right?
Mhm.
And it's harder to get that in sort of embedded in your thinking if you've
Right.
only seen it in a video, right?
So, for example, um, I'm trying to think of the word. Some of the simulators, not necessarily all the ones we own. We have regular simulation with actual heads, mannequins, and jaws and things like that. But there are some simulators that rely on haptic technology.
Mm-hmm.
So supposedly you can feel resistance
Yeah, yeah.
but then I said, but then you're looking at a screen and there's nothing in front of you other than this handpiece that is connected to a device that gives you haptic feeling.
Right.
And I'm like, that's never going to happen in practice. There's
Right.
always going to
You're
be a
looking at
head.
what you're touching, right?
Right.
It's a little strange, right?
And it's very strange. And I know that surgeons are using this kind of training to do laparoscopic surgeries. Because they are inside a cavity and therefore cannot see. But inside the mouth, you can see the mouth.
Right.
So when you're using an instrument that can cut and you are inside a person's mouth, you have to be able to feel what's all around them, so that you don't hurt anything else.
Right.
But I think I remember. So I will say, number one, in terms of BU, we have bought all of the technology,
all the possible technology available.
toys.
You got it right.
we got all the toys, and I mean we just went through a very expensive addition renovation where we added all of the digital technology in the clinic and in our simulation learning center. So our students have access to all the 3D stuff that they could ever want.
Yeah.
And I remember when we first introduced it, was maybe nearly 10 years ago, I remember my students saying, "Oh, now we can just mill the temporaries, Dr. Kong. We don't actually have to make them ourselves." And I'm saying, no. You're still going to make them yourselves. If we mill anything, we'll be milling final restorations, because you still need to learn how to make that tooth, that temporary on your own. Because I don't think every one of you is going to buy this equipment when you leave us.
Yeah.
And if you don't have it and you didn't learn how to do this, you wouldn't be able to see your patient. So they're still learning traditional ways of doing things in addition to all the digital things that they're learning.
I found this to be so interesting. I was talking to someone who's a great professor in engineering, in mechanical engineering, and he said that to me that it's fascinating because the pendulum sort of is swinging around the other way. That it used to be that students that came to mechanical engineering program, they would have been spending the whole teenage years putting together cars in the driveways and building their own whatever mechanical pieces that scratch their itches, and they are usually coming in really sort of like, I've built this, I've done that, really sort of, I launch a rocket, that kind of thing, really sort of like hands-on accomplished, but doesn't know the don't really know deeply why this happens and how does it, why do we design things a certain way? But then they come to the program and they sort of learn that. And then over time, though, he said that students don't come with those anymore. Much less people will come in with
more video games.
Right.
They've done
a lot of like 3D stuff, and they might also come in just sort of, actually they've gone and have taken engineering classes. So they know some of the principles coming in, but yet some of the students will go through the entire undergraduate program and sometimes graduate program having never built let's call it just a machine, because they didn't have to. Or if they built it, it's more like a little extension, or they just never put in the hours, like getting literally the elbow, rolling the sleeves up and getting greasy and really just sort of be like, I can't lift this. How am I going to do this? And interestingly, at some point of that sort of program, it went from mechanical engineer, but if you came with too much like hands-on experience, you are supposed to go to the vocational part of being a mechanic, and you shouldn't be an engineer. And there was some like really strange sort of, I mean, I guess it's not strange, it's just that's what happened. They started to sort of create these different paths. And now actually a lot of the engineering programs are craving back into we got to get you to build something, get you to
probably robots.
Right. But now exactly, they're building robots. And I know that there's one program that I thought was amazing. They had students build what do you call these? a flying machine.
Oh,
So
really?
you basically
That's big.
really light machines, and you are using human power to cycle, and
Mm-hmm.
that powers something that can fly.
Mm-hmm.
It's a notoriously difficult thing to do, but like they have students do, but like that gives them the opportunity to do things that are hands on,
Yes.
and it sort of combines a lot of the theories and everything back together. But my point really being is, like using the technology by itself, sometimes, you can sort of forget. And I actually, I mean, we talked a lot about this and we didn't even get back onto some of the things that I definitely wanted to ask you about, which is I think you and I met, I must
Quite a
say,
while ago.
yeah, it was years ago now, but
Quite a
isn't it,
while ago.
I think you were just
I was
stepping
a
into,
director.
you were in the, you were director, you weren't the
I
chair
wasn't chair
yet.
yet.
So this must have been 8 years ago, 9 years
Yeah,
ago, something
probably.
like that.
I would probably say, yeah, 9
Yeah.
years or so ago.
Now, B, you at the time had already been using
Oh, yes.
portfolios, has a lot of
Yes.
successful,
Yes.
implementations. But what drew you to think about portfolios for your students? Now, as you said, you have the resource, you have all the toys. What drew you to think about using portfolios with your students?
So I had already started asking students when I was a director for restorative dentistry to put together cases, and they would do it on paper or they would do it on PowerPoint after paper, where they would get me the models, show me the models of their patients, and explain to me what they had done so that I could see a before and after. And that transitioned from the actual casts and models on and paper to the PowerPoint presentation. And then from the PowerPoint presentation, I said, if they started building these portfolios or these cases in a different medium where they could take it with them and they could show multiple versions of whatever it is they had accomplished, then they would have something to take to a prospective employer or a program director if they were planning to go to a postdoc program. So really what I wanted our students to do was to shine, to make themselves shine in a way that was more mobile, because carrying casts and models of patients
Right,
to
that's
an
tough. Yep.
interview,
Mhm.
that's tough.
Yep.
And it's much better if you can do it digitally. Um, and the initial ones were definitely PowerPoint, and they're still on PowerPoint, but maybe now uploaded to Digication. But that was my premise. I wanted our students to show work so that they could shine. And then as I learned more about ePortfolios, I think I met you once at an ePortfolio conference that was held on Charles River campus. And the person who organized it is someone who has done another podcast from you. And we met people from Australia and people from England who had different kinds of medium to do electronic portfolios.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, I went through the British system of high school where everything was handwritten in longhand. There was no such thing as a multiple guess exam. It was always an essay exam,
Yeah.
and you learned how to write for hours and hours. Um, and I could see that the Brits and the Australians still had a lot of that going on. I don't want to call it a problem, but our system is such that many of our students will not have had an essay exam in years, or have a piece of written reflection other than if they had a required essay to write or a required paper to write. And what I learned from attending some of these conferences with you as well is that if students reflected on the things that they were accomplishing, you could also assess other skills. So you could, dental school, our Commission on Dental Accreditation requires that they know how to communicate, that they have critical thinking skills. And, when way back in the 80s and 90s, they didn't talk about critical thinking skills and evidence-based dentistry. They talked about mostly the psychomotor skills.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about having to pass psychomotor skill exams. Now we're talking about other things, and learning how to assess those other skills was not always an easy turnaround for many faculty members or for the students for that matter. And I actually had difficulty selling this concept to some of my colleagues because they said, I'd have to read all of that. When am I going to have time to read all of that? When are the students going to have time to upload all of that? I'm like, you will be surprised. I believe you will be surprised by what they submit to you. And so, of course, as the director for restorative dentistry, I could manage what I was doing for my students and my colleagues. But as a chair, I had more clout, shall I say,
Yeah.
to be able to ask other faculty members to use different tools to assess critical thinking and communication skills. And in fact, when we went through our last accreditation, we said, these are some of the things that we do. We have them reflect and we have them post them on their ePortfolios. And I think that went really well. In fact, one of our students was asked during our last accreditation to show them what she had online. And she showed them a case, and something that she had posted on her ePortfolio, which is, of course, the Digication platform. And then they asked her how else she would see whether she had reached competency. And we have other digital platforms where they can look at grades and how they've progressed. So she could pull that up and show that to them as well. So I will say that one of my favorite so-called newer projects was the one where I asked our faculty members who go to the Isabella Gardner Museum to ask our students to reflect upon what they learned in terms of visual thinking strategies. Have you ever heard of visual thinking strategies?
No. Tell me more.
It's actually how art meets critical thinking, and art meets how a person assesses what they see. So it's also, art, there's no wrong answer about how a person feels about a piece of art because it affects different people differently, and I gave a screenshot, for example, about the visual thinking strategies at ISG, which is Isabella Gardner. And what the students do is they go there and they break out into small groups with a consultant who knows how to make them think about what they're seeing. The consultant will say, look at this piece of art and tell me not what you see, but tell me what you think is happening in this piece of art. So that's a very different question than what do you see, because you can talk about colors perhaps, or you can talk about how many people there are in a painting. But when you ask them, what do you think's happening in this picture or in this statue? They start having to look at it a little bit differently and like, well, what happened to make this picture what it is? You could say, well, we think the woman lying on this bed, she doesn't look well. And then the person will say, well, what makes you say that? And a person might say, well, her complexion, the people sitting next to her don't look happy. So they start thinking about what might be happening. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to develop observation skills.
Mhm.
And so some medical schools have used this visual thinking strategies. And I think we did this, I want to say about 15 years ago. We started saying, let's take our students. It's a fun outing. Let's take them out to the museum and we'll have the consultants go through this visual thinking strategy exercise and make them realize that they have skills that they haven't really used. And then they have to verbally explain, communicate to their peers what it is they see. And they might see different things on the same painting. And the thing that I think is really kind of cool is that it is a fun outing. There are no wrong answers because art is such that, like I said earlier, you can feel anything about a piece of art. There's no wrong answer. So there's nothing to intimidate a student by saying, oh, I don't want to participate because I might say something wrong.
Right.
And a few years ago, I said to the faculty members who are doing this module, let's call it, they only go there once. All 200 students will go there at different times and in different groups. I said, so what do you do to assess the success of this program? Well, the usual student evaluations. Like, okay, you ask them 2 or 3 questions about whether they liked it or not, but it's also multiple choice,
Right.
On a grid of 1 to 5, how did you feel? I said, but why don't you ask them to reflect on the experience of how they have to communicate and how they have to make observations? And the faculty looked at me like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. And then we'll have to read them. I go, yes. And then you have to create a rubric. You have to create a rubric in order to judge how well they did this submission, and Isabella Gardner, it didn't happen right away. They weren't sure about allowing students to take photographs.
Mm.
So the first couple of years, the students weren't allowed to take photographs. So they just had written reflections. But in the recent years, Isabella Gardner said, you know what, it's fine. They can take pictures of whatever they want. So students now post pieces of art or pictures of the Gardner Museum and talk about some of the pieces that they were asked to observe. And actually, the faculty members said, wow, some of these students really, really got it. And when they talk about how people of different backgrounds will see different things, that brings into question the diversity of our student population, right?
Mm.
That shows us that not everybody, a lot of older pieces of art are Christian in nature. But if you're not Christian, you might not really get what's happening in that.
Right. The context would be completely lost without
absolutely lost. It's just another photograph or another painting. But I think, it's a very interesting exercise because different students will see very different things.
This concludes part 1 of our conversation. To hear part 2, be sure to subscribe to Digication Scholars Conversations on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. The Digication Scholars Conversations series is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative ePortfolio programs in K-12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for tuning in.